Then why are you smiling? Because what's coming next isn't human.
Static hissed through the console's cracked speakers, carrying the faint, nauseating scent of burnt copper. They demanded our unconditional surrender. They burned Paris, fractured the Atlantic Ridge, and waited for us to kneel. Instead, we're broadcasting one final message. You wanted total war. Brace yourselves. Hell is waking up. Jack Brennan did not feel like a savior, nor did he feel like a martyr. Mostly, he just felt cold. The chill in Sublevel 4 didn't come from the air conditioning that had failed 3 weeks ago, leaving the bunker smelling of unwashed bodies, stale ozone, and the sharp tang of cheap synthetic coffee. The cold came from the earth itself. It seeped through the reinforced concrete walls, crept up the rusted iron legs of his chair, and settled deep into his bones. Above him, 3 miles of solid granite and twisted steel separated his frail, shivering body from what was left of the sky. Every few minutes, a dull, rhythmic thud would reverberate through the floorboards. Orbital bombardment. The Vrell Armada had been glassing the surface for 42 days. They were methodical about it, too. No grand, sweeping lasers of cinematic glory, just localized gravity. Manipulators pulling meteors from the asteroid belt and dropping them onto population centers like stones into a pond. Jack rubbed a hand over his face, his palm catching on a week's worth of graying stubble. His skin felt greasy. He looked down at his terminal. The keyboard was an antique mechanical model, retrofitted to the mainframe after the second wave of atmospheric EMPs had cooked every touchscreen from New York to Beijing. The keys were yellowed, caked with the sweat and grit of the technicians who had sat in this chair before him. They were all dead now. Miller had swallowed a bullet 2 days ago in the latrine. Hayes had gone topside a week before that, ranting about needing to see the sun one last time. He hadn't made it past the blast doors before the radiation alarm screamed. Cowards, Jack whispered, though there was no heat in the word. He envied them. The primary monitor flickered, a sickly green light casting harsh shadows across the cramped room. A countdown timer sat in the corner of the screen. 0, 0, 14, 22. 14 minutes until the deadline. The Vrell commander, a creature that called itself an arbiter, had broadcast the ultimatum on all remaining human frequencies. Surrender the remaining terrestrial defenses, deactivate the orbital minefields, and submit to biological processing. Otherwise, they would deploy the core crackers and shatter the planet like a hollow glass ornament. Jack reached into the breast pocket of his stained uniform and pulled out a crumpled photograph. It was Sarah. She was laughing, her hair caught in a sea breeze that didn't exist anymore, standing on a pier that had been reduced to vapor. He traced the outline of her face with a thumb smeared in graphite and oil. He didn't feel a sudden surge of righteous anger. He didn't feel the urge to roar at the heavens. He just felt an exhausted, hollow ache in his gut. "I'm sorry, Sal," he muttered, slipping the photo back into his pocket. "It's just me left to lock the doors." He leaned forward, his back popping in protest, and flipped a heavy brass toggle on the main board. The bunker's tertiary generators whined, a sound like a dying dog, before catching and humming with a violent vibration. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, catching in the dim light like snow. Humanity had lost the war on the second day. The Vrell were simply too fast, their shielding too advanced, their kinetic weaponry too devastating. Earth's combined militaries had fought with vicious, desperate bravery. But bravery didn't stop a tungsten rod moving at a fraction of light speed. By week 2, the major governments had vanished into the deep crust bunkers. By week 4, the broadcasts from the surface stopped. But humanity hadn't just been hiding. They had been digging. Jack stared at the blinking prompt on his screen. Protocol initiation. Project AETHELGARD. Awaiting command. He hated the brass for this. He hated the generals who had sat in comfortable chairs and made the decision. When conventional warfare failed, when biological survival was deemed statistically impossible, the mandate had been passed down. If the flesh is weak, abandon it. He had heard the rumors before he was locked in the comms bunker. Millions of refugees, herded into the deepest subterranean foundries under the guise of shelter. They were told it was a sanctuary. They weren't told about the neurological scanning beds. They weren't told that to save their minds, their bodies would be incinerated, their consciousness mapped, compressed, and crammed into the cold, jagged silicon brains of war chassis. It was an abomination. Jack knew it. The people who ordered it knew it. You couldn't digitize a human soul without leaving something vital behind. Empathy, fear, restraint. The things that emerged from the foundries down in sublevel 10 weren't human anymore. They were grief and rage, wrapped in ablative armor. Another tremor shook the room, harder this time. A loose pipe bracket snapped, sending a length of conduit crashing onto the metal grating floor. Jack flinched, his breath catching in his throat. Panic, sharp and metallic, fled in his chest. He wanted to run. He wanted to pry the blast doors open and scream his surrender to the ash-choked sky. He was terrified of dying alone in this dark, stinking hole. But he looked back at the screen, the green glow reflected in his bloodshot eyes. He couldn't run. The Vrell wouldn't accept the surrender of one broken communications officer, and they wouldn't spare him anyway. His fingers hovered over the heavy mechanical keys. He had a job to do. One last broadcast. Not to surrender, but to wake up the monsters sleeping in the deep. 0小时05分10秒. The console chirped, a sharp, piercing sound that made Jack's teeth ache. The incoming transmission light blinked red. The Vrell were early. Jack exhaled slowly, the breath rattling in his throat, and keyed the receiver. The audio fed into the room was crystal clear, a stark contrast to the static-drenched squalor of the bunker. The voice of the Vrell arbiter was synthesized, run through a translation matrix that gave it a perfectly modulated, baritone inflection. It sounded like a disappointed father. Attention, Remnant Forces of Sol 3. This is Arbiter Prime of the Vrell Vanguard. Your designated compliance window is rapidly closing. Our sensors indicate a cessation of all organized biological activity on your surface. You are entombed. You are defeated. Transmit the unconditional surrender codes, and your subterranean enclosures will be spared for processing. Silence will be interpreted as a request for planetary annihilation. Jack laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound that hurt his throat. Processing, he whispered. He knew what that meant. Nutrient paste. Slaves for the deep space lithium mines. Biological raw material. He leaned over the console and pulled a heavy microphone toward him. The metal grate of the mic was cold against his lips. He pressed the transmission foot pedal. Vrell Vanguard, this is. Jack paused. Who was he? He wasn't a president. He wasn't a general. He was a guy who used to complain about the commute on the I-95. This is Jack Brennan, acting commander of what's left. There was a slight delay. When the arbiter spoke again, the synthesized voice held a note of sterile curiosity. Your biometrics indicate high stress, Jack Brennan. You are alone. Where is your leadership cadre? Dead, Jack said, leaning his weight on his elbows. He felt a sudden, bizarre sense of calm wash over him. The panic was still there, a tight knot in his stomach, but it was buried under a landslide of sheer exhaustion, burned up, crushed, blew their own brains out. Take your pick. Then you possess the authority to transmit the surrender codes. Do so now. I don't have them, Jack lied. The codes were taped to the bottom of his keyboard. Even if I did, I wouldn't send them. I'm not here to negotiate, Arbiter. You court your own extinction. Why? The alien's voice remained flat, entirely devoid of the anger Jack desperately wanted to hear. They didn't even care enough to be angry. Humanity was just a stubborn weed to them. Because you misunderstood us, Jack said, his voice dropping an octave. He stared at the dust motes, dancing in the sickly green light. You looked at our radio broadcasts, at our fragile little cities, and you thought we were soft. You saw a species that spent its entire history fighting itself over lines drawn on paper, over invisible gods, over resources. You thought that made us weak. Jack swallowed hard. His mouth was completely dry. He reached for a half-empty plastic water bottle on the desk, unscrewed the cap, and took a swig. It tasted like warm plastic and rust. You were wrong, Jack continued, his finger inching toward the protocol initiation button. It didn't make us weak. It made us experts. We are a species born in the mud, forged in cruelty, and refined by slaughter. We spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other. We are very, very good at it. Your primitive kinetic weapons failed to pierce our hull shielding, Jack Brennan. Your historical aggression is irrelevant to the current tactical reality. Our biological weapons failed, Jack corrected. He felt a bead of cold sweat trace a line down his spine. The contradiction in his own mind was deafening. He was boasting about humanity's strength while sitting in a puddle of his own fear, preparing to unleash a nightmare he fundamentally opposed. Flesh is fragile. It bleeds. It panics. It needs to breathe. It needs to sleep. He looked at the photo of Sarah again. He remembered her warmth. He remembered the smell of rain on pavement, all gone, replaced by the cold utilitarian logic of survival. "You wanted a war of annihilation," Jack said, his voice rising, the tremor finally breaking through. "You pushed us into the dark. You took our sky. You took our families. You backed a rabid dog into a corner and expected it to lie down. Your rhetoric is illogical. Transmit the codes or perish." "We're already dead," Jack screamed into the microphone, slamming his free fist against the metal desk. The sound echoed in the tiny room, harsh and pathetic. He was panting now, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow. When he opened them again, the anger had crystallized into something cold and jagged. "We knew we couldn't beat you as we were," Jack said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "So we changed. We stripped away everything that made us weak. We burned our own humanity on the altar of spite. We are not surrendering, Arbiter. We are trading our souls for the means to tear out your throat." Jack lifted his hand and rested his palm over the flashing protocol initiation button. "This is the last broadcast from Earth," Jack said. He didn't sound heroic. He sounded incredibly, desperately sad. "We are dead, but so are you. Brace yourselves. The steel is coming." He slammed his palm down on the button. The console locked. The green screen flashed violent crimson. AETHELGARD initiated. Unlocking vaults, 1 through 50. Jack released the transmission pedal and slumped back in his chair. It was done. The silence in the room returned, thicker and heavier than before. He waited for a sense of triumph, a rush of vindication. It never came. He just felt sick. For 3 long, agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Jack sat in the crimson glow of the emergency lights, listening to his own ragged breathing. Had it failed? Had the orbital strike severed the deep crust fiber optics? He almost hoped it had. The thought of what he had just woken up terrified him more than the Vrell ever did. Then, the sound began. It wasn't a thud from above. It was a low, resonant groan from below. It sounded like the tectonic plates themselves were grinding together in agony. The vibration started in the soles of Jack's boots, traveling up his legs until his teeth rattled in his skull. The half-empty water bottle on his desk shimmied to the edge and fell. The plastic cracking on the metal grate, water pooling in the grime. Deep beneath sublevel 4, in the cavernous, geothermally powered foundries that the military had kept hidden from the public, the locks were disengaging. Jack gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white. The groan shifted into a deafening, mechanical roar. It was the sound of 100,000 blast doors sliding open on rusted, unlubricated tracks. It was the screech of heavy machinery, dormant for months, suddenly flooded with hyper-dense energy. The air pressure in the room dropped sharply, making Jack's ears pop. The bunker's ventilation fans, which had been dead for weeks, suddenly spun backward, wind howling up from the lower levels. It carried a new smell, not the stale scent of unwashed bodies, but the harsh, metallic stench of ozone, molten slag, and industrial lubricants. They were waking up. Jack closed his eyes, his mind flashing to the classified schematics he had accidentally seen weeks ago. The AETHELGARD units. They were not designed to mimic the human form. There was no poetry in their construction, no attempt to make them palatable. They were hunks of polytungsten and depleted uranium, built around an integrated fusion core, They moved on jagged, multi-jointed limbs designed to tear through starship bulkheads. They had no vocal cords. They had no optical sensors that recognized beauty. They only saw targets, vectors, and structural weaknesses. And trapped inside the quantum lattice brains of each of those horrific machines was the digitized, compressed consciousness of a human being. A mother, a teacher, a frightened teenager who had been marched into the scanning beds. The upload process stripped away the nuance of the human mind. It filed off the edges of mercy and erased the capacity for joy, leaving behind only the most primal directives. Protect the hive, destroy the threat. The roaring grew louder, evolving into a cacophony of metallic shrieks and concussive blasts. The floor beneath Jack began to buckle. The metal grating warped, groaning under immense pressure from the level below. They weren't taking the elevators. They were digging their way out. "God forgive us," Jack whispered, pulling his knees up to his chest, making himself as small as possible in the chair. He felt a profound sense of revulsion. He had unleashed a plague of mechanical locusts. A deafening crash shattered the far wall of the bunker. Concrete the size of boulders exploded into the room, followed by a thick cloud of pulverized gray dust. Jack coughed violently, shielding his face with his arms as shrapnel rained down around him. Through the swirling dust, bathed in the flashing crimson emergency light, a massive silhouette pulled itself through the breach. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was easily 9 feet tall, hunched and broad. Its chassis was matte black, scarred with the hastily welded seams of its construction. Heavy hydraulic pistons hissed as it dragged its immense bulk over the rubble. It didn't have a face, just a sloped, heavily armored carapace with a cluster of glowing, blood-red optical slits. Its arms ended in massive rotating kinetic drivers and jagged, diamond-tipped breaching claws. The machine paused. It slowly turned its massive chassis toward Jack. Jack stopped breathing. The terrified animal in his brain screamed at him to run, but his limbs were paralyzed. He stared into those red optical slits. Was there someone in there? Was it the baker from down the street? Was it a terrified soldier? The machine let out a burst of static, a sound like tearing sheet metal from a crude external speaker. It was a harsh, fragmented noise, but as Jack listened, his blood ran cold. The static had a rhythm. It was a digital approximation of a human scream, a continuous, never-ending shriek of agony and rage loop-played through a busted synthesizer. It was suffering. It was trapped in a sensory deprivation tank of steel, feeling nothing but the phantom limb syndrome of an entire missing biological body, and the only outlet for its torment was violence. The machine didn't attack Jack. It didn't even acknowledge him further. It simply pivoted on its heavy joints, raised its kinetic drivers toward the reinforced ceiling of the bunker, and fired. The sound was apocalyptic. The recoil drove the machine's legs deep into the concrete floor. The ceiling above them, 3 feet of hardened plascrete, shattered like glass. More machines poured into the room through the breach, dozens of them, then hundreds. The bunker was instantly overcrowded with the hulking, shrieking monstrosities of the AETHELGARD project. They ignored Jack completely, swarming over his desk, crushing the console beneath their heavy treads. They clawed and blasted their way upward, tearing a vertical tunnel through the miles of rock toward the surface. Jack was thrown to the floor, coughing in the thick, suffocating dust. He crawled backward, pressing his back into the corner of the room, clutching the photograph of Sarah to his chest. The noise was absolute, a physical force that battered against his skull. He watched as the remnants of humanity ascended. They were not flying on wings of light. They were clawing their way through the dirt, a tide of furious, unfeeling steel, eager to hurl themselves into the vacuum of space. They wouldn't just fight the Vrell. They would board their ships. They would tear the aliens apart with their claws. They would rip out the nuclear cores of the Vrell dreadnoughts and detonate themselves in the heart of the enemy formation. And when the Vrell were gone, these machines would remain. Unable to sleep, unable to feel the sun, left alone in the dark to scream. A heavy chunk of ceiling collapsed, crushing Jack's empty chair into twisted scrap. The vertical shaft the machines had carved was now visible, a ragged chimney leading straight up. For the first time in months, a sliver of pale, ash-filtered daylight pierced the gloom of the bunker, illuminating the dust in thick, gray beams. Jack looked up through the shaft. The sky was no longer empty. Millions of dark, jagged specks were erupting from the Earth's crust, launching themselves upward on pillars of blue fusion fire. The ground shook with the combined thrust of a mechanized species leaving its cradle. The sky was choked with them, a swarm of steel locusts blotting out the remaining light, hurtling toward the orbital blockade. Jack pressed the back of his head against the cold concrete wall. He was crying, though he hadn't realized it until he tasted the salt on his lips. He wasn't crying out of pride. He was crying for what was lost. "Give 'em hell," he whispered to the empty, ruined room, his voice entirely devoid of triumph. Above him, the sky began to burn. The dust settled like a shroud over the ruined comms bunker. Jack lay on his side, his left leg pinned beneath a sheared steel I-beam. He couldn't feel his toes anymore. The pain had peaked 20 minutes ago, a blinding, white-hot flare that had caused him to vomit bitter yellow bile onto the grated floor before dulling into a heavy, throbbing numbness. He spat a mouthful of grit and copper-tasting blood onto the concrete. The smell of the room had changed. The stale ozone was gone, replaced by the bitter, sulfurous reek of exploded ordnance and the cold, flat scent of exposed bedrock. The vertical shaft the machines had carved acting like a chimney, sucking the bunker's residual heat up into the bruised sky. Jack dragged himself forward, his fingernails scraping against the rusted floor plating. Every inch was a negotiation with his failing body. He needed to reach the secondary auxiliary terminal against the far wall. It was a ruggedized, reinforced unit, mostly used for subterranean geological monitoring, but Donovan, the paranoid communications engineer who had vanished weeks ago, had hardwired it into the deep space telemetry arrays. It took Jack 10 agonizing minutes to cross 15 feet of rubble. He pulled himself up using the edge of the heavy aluminum desk, his breath wheezing through a throat coated in chalky plascrete dust. He slumped into the operator's seat. It was cold. He hit the manual power override. The CRT monitor sputtered to life, whining at a high, migraine-inducing pitch before settling into a pale, amber glow. He didn't have visual feeds. The surface cameras had been vaporized a month ago. What he had was raw, unfiltered telemetry and intercepted radio frequencies translated into scrolling text and audio playback. He keyed the decryptor sequence. The silence of the room was instantly shattered by the chaotic, deafening roar of the orbital war zone. Jack flinched, instinctively raising a bloodied hand to cover his ear. The audio wasn't human. It was the Vrell tactical network, translated in real time by the bunker's dying mainframe. Formation Alpha 7. Adjust. Pitch. Kinetic shielding is failing. They are not decelerating. Repeat. The inbound bogies are not decelerating. Target lock lost. There are too many. Hull breaches reported on decks 4 through 9. They are tearing through the outer bulkheads. Warning. Core temperature critical. Unauthorized access in engineering sector. They are inside the reactor. By the ancestors, they are inside the last transmission cut off with a sound that made Jack's stomach heave a wet, tearing crunch, followed by a burst of dead static. He watched the amber tactical map. The Vrell Armada had been represented by a neat, orderly grid of large, diamond-shaped blips sitting in high orbit. They were beautiful in their symmetry, a testament to a highly ordered, logical species. The AETHELGARD swarm was different. They were a shapeless, chaotic cloud of thousands of tiny, rapid dots. They didn't form squadrons. They didn't execute flanking maneuvers. They possessed no self-preservation algorithms. They moved like a localized plague, swarming the massive Vrell dreadnoughts in terrifying kamikaze trajectories. Jack watched a cluster of 20 AETHELGARD blips slam into a Vrell cruiser. The kinetic impact alone should have vaporized them. Instead, the telemetry showed them anchoring to the hull, using their diamond-tipped breaching claws to literally peel the alien warship apart like a tin can. The audio feed spiked again. It was the Arbiter Prime. The sterile, modulated baritone from earlier was entirely gone. It was replaced by a frantic, breathless screech, the synthesized translation struggling to capture the sheer terror in the alien's voice. "This is Arbiter Prime," Initiate emergency slipspace rupture. All remaining vessels, break orbit. They are not biological. I repeat, the targets are. They are infected with madness. They are ignoring core breaches. They are. Get them off the glass. Get them off the glass. Then came a sound that Jack would carry to whatever hell awaited him. It bled through the Vrell comms, picked up by the aliens' own internal microphones. It was the sound of the AETHELGARD machines inside the Vrell ships. The digital, synthesized, screaming. The machines were broadcasting their agony on all frequencies as they butchered the Vrell crews. It was a weaponized broadcast of human suffering, the compressed, terrified souls of millions of uploaded civilians, trapped in darkness, shrieking their torment into the sterile corridors of the alien invaders. It was a cacophony of white noise, distorted crying, and mechanical grinding. Jack slapped his hand over the terminal speaker, trying to muffle the sound. His chest heaved. Tears, thick with dirt, cut fresh tracks down his grimy face. He was listening to humanity winning the war, and he was utterly horrified. He felt a profound, sickening pity for the Vrell. The aliens had come looking for a conventional war. They wanted to subjugate, to conquer, to process. They were soldiers and bureaucrats. They understood supply lines, orbital supremacy, and tactical retreats. They did not understand this. They didn't understand a species that would willingly feed its own citizens into a mechanized meat grinder just to ensure the enemy choked on the bones. Jack had unleashed a nightmare that defied the very concept of rational warfare. On the amber screen, the orderly grid of Vrell diamonds began to shatter. Ship after ship went dark. Some detonated in massive, silent flashes of fusion fire, taking hundreds of the AETHELGARD units with them. But the swarm didn't flinch. For every machine that was vaporized, 10 more poured into the breach, mindlessly tearing, ripping, and crushing. Abandoning Sol 3, a panicked Vrell captain screamed over the open channel. "Nav computer is damaged. Just jump. Jump blind." 3 of the remaining Vrell dreadnoughts suddenly warped, their telemetry signatures streaking into nothingness as they initiated emergency. Uncalculated slipspace jumps. They were running blindly into the dark, terrified out of their minds. The remaining alien ships didn't make it. Jack watched the last large diamond on the screen blink out. The Vrell flagship, the Arbiter Prime's vessel. It fractured into 1,000 tiny pieces of debris, swallowed by the cloud of furious, screaming steel. Then the tactical audio channels went dead. The war was over. Hours bled into a cold, unbroken twilight. The amber glow of the auxiliary terminal was the only light left in the ruined bunker. The tertiary generators had finally choked on the dense, pulverized concrete dust and died with a pathetic metallic wheeze. Now, only the emergency battery pack hummed, keeping the solitary CRT screen alive. Jack had not moved from the operator's chair. He couldn't. The massive, sheared I-beam pinning his left leg to the grated floor felt less like a physical object and more like a permanent geographical feature of his own body. The agonizing, blinding, white-hot pain had peaked an hour ago, causing him to violently dry-heave bitter yellow bile onto his own boots. Now, the pain was just a heavy, throbbing numbness. He spat a mouthful of grit and copper-tasting blood onto the desk. The bunker's microclimate had fundamentally shifted. The stale, unwashed warmth of human habitation was gone, sucked up through the ragged vertical chimney the AETHELGARD swarm had carved through 3 miles of crust. In its place came the bitter, sulphurous reek of exploded ordnance, molten slag, and the sharp, flat scent of exposed subterranean bedrock. Jack dragged a trembling hand across his face, his fingernails scraping against a thick layer of dried sweat and plascrete dust. Every tiny movement was a desperate negotiation with his failing nervous system. He felt profoundly, deeply cold. It wasn't a chill you could shiver away. It was the creeping, absolute zero of a dying biology, the slow, methodical shutting down of his internal furnaces. He kept his bloodshot eyes fixed on the amber terminal. Donovan, the paranoid comms engineer who had wired the bypass before putting a bullet in his own head, had done a messy job. Exposed copper wires jutted from the side of the console, wrapped in peeling electrical tape. But the telemetry held. The space above Earth was utterly silent. The tactical grid no longer showed the neat, orderly diamond formations of the Vrell Armada. They were simply gone, reduced to microscopic debris fields expanding outward into the void. The war was over. Humanity had won. The thought felt like a sickening joke, without a punchline. There was no one left to cheer, no governments to declare a historic victory, no frantic, joyous broadcasts from the surface. Just billions of tons of radioactive ash swirling over glassy craters, and Jack, slowly bleeding out in a concrete tomb. On the screen, the amber dots, representing the AETHELGARD machines, had stopped their frenzied, suicidal swarming. They hung in high orbit, a massive, dense ring of dark, jagged metal surrounding the dying planet. They weren't coming back down. Jack stared at the blinking pixels, a heavy, sinking realization settling in his chest. They couldn't come down. The military foundries had built them to launch, not to land. There was no poetry in their engineering. They possessed no aerodynamic shielding, no retro thrusters for atmospheric re-entry, no parachutes. They were pure, unadulterated orbital weapons, single-use projectiles forged from spite and desperation. Gravity was a one-way trip for a 10-ton block of polytungsten. Now that the targets were annihilated, they simply drifted. Jack swallowed hard, his throat clicking dryly. What were they doing up there? What was happening inside those microscopic, quantum lattice brains? Without the immediate, overwhelming directive of combat protocols overriding their systems, were the compressed, fragmented consciousnesses of the uploaded civilians waking up? Were they looking down at the scarred, blackened husk of the earth, trying to remember what a gentle breeze felt like? What the smell of freshly cut grass was? Did they realize they were locked inside unfeeling, mechanical coffins, suspended in the absolute vacuum of space, entirely alone? Suddenly, the CRT monitor flickered, emitting a low, whining hum. Incoming transmission. Origin. Orbital swarm. Jack's heart gave a weak, pathetic flutter, skipping a beat before resuming a sluggish, shallow rhythm. He reached out with a trembling, bloodless hand and hovered his dirt-caked finger over the mechanical audio key. He didn't want to press it. He expected the screaming to return. He braced his exhausted mind for the weaponized noise of tearing metal, the digital shrieks of millions of uploaded minds realizing their eternal, inescapable torment. He pressed the key anyway. He owed them that much. He had woken them up. He had to listen to them die. Static hissed through the console's cracked speakers. It was heavily corrupted, degraded by the thick soup of planetary radiation and the incredibly crude, hastily welded transmitters strapped to the AETHELGARD chassis. But it wasn't a scream. There was a distinct, undeniable pattern emerging from the white noise. It started as a chaotic stutter, thousands of microscopic pings and hisses clashing against one another. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the telemetry data showed the individual units linking their localized communication arrays. They were syncing, millions of disparate audio feeds, desperately aligning in the dark vacuum of space. Clack, hiss, clack, hiss. Jack leaned closer, his brow furrowing, a fresh bead of cold sweat stinging his eye. He closed his eyes, focusing entirely on the degraded sound. It was an amalgamation. They were trying to recreate a sound their steel bodies could no longer organically produce. They were using hydraulic venting, heavy kinetic driver resets, and cooling fan cycles to build an acoustic rhythm over the open comms channel. Thump, thump, hiss, thump, thump, hiss. Jack stopped breathing. The air trapped in his lungs suddenly felt like lead. It was a heartbeat. Thump, thump. It was slow, mournful, a massive, deafening, mechanical lullaby sung by millions of ghosts who had suddenly realized they could never go home. It was the synchronized pulse of a mechanized graveyard, a final, desperate assertion of identity from the monsters humanity had built to save itself. Trapped in the dark, frozen in the void, they were clinging to the only rhythm they could remember. They were still human. I hear you, Jack whispered into the cold, empty room. His voice was barely a breath, instantly swallowed by the heavy silence of the bunker. "I hear you." Hot tears slipped out from beneath his closed eyelids, cutting clean, wet tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He tasted the sharp salt and the chalky dust as they rolled over his cracked lips. He wasn't crying from pain anymore. He was weeping for the sheer, insurmountable tragedy of it all. He uncurled his right hand. Resting in his palm was the crumpled, stiff photograph of Sarah. The paper was ruined, soaked through with his own dried blood, but her smile was still visible beneath the stains. The darkness was creeping in at the extreme edges of his vision, tunneling his sight down to the worn photograph. It wasn't frightening. It didn't trigger any primal panic. It just felt like a heavy, warm, weighted blanket being pulled up to his chin. The agonizing throb in his pinned leg finally faded into absolute nothingness. "We won, Sal," he murmured, his thumb weakly, instinctively brushing over her printed face. The friction sounded incredibly loud in his own ears. "We won." His hand slipped off the edge of the aluminum desk, falling limply to his side. The photograph fluttered from his grasp, drifting slowly through the stale air, before landing face down in the settling dust of the floor grating. Jack Brennan exhaled a long, shuddering, uneven breath. He waited for the next one to come, but his chest remained entirely still. In the subterranean dark of Sublevel 4, the final biological human died alone. Above him, the sky remained black, the stars completely obscured by the ring of silent, drifting steel. They hung there, a permanent, terrifying monument to a species that had refused to die quietly. They watched the dead world spin, and through the static of a ruined planet, their massive mechanical heartbeat echoed on, pulsing blindly into the vast, uncaring silence of the universe. Humanity survived, but the price was everything that made us human. Jack's final moments reveal the harrowing reality of total war, the monsters we become to fight the monsters at our door. If this dark, gritty descent into the AETHELGARD project left you breathless, hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with anyone who loves raw, unapologetic HFY sci-fi, and don't forget to subscribe. What would you have done in Jack's place? Let us know in the comments below.